This program has been made possible by the generous support of these organizations at Stanford University: Office of the Provost, Institute for International Studies, School of Humanities and Sciences, and Ambassador and Mrs. L. W. Lane, Jr., Donald L. Lucas, the Russell Family Foundation, Ronald P. Spogli. International Environmental Politics was offered to students at Stanford University as part of the International Policy Studies program during Winter Quarter 2001.
Okay, so what we're going to do today is sort of pick up some of the stuff that I laid out for you last class, some of the articles, and partly the goal is to give you a sense of what the main core of the class is. So this should, if you really fall asleep today, then you don't want to be in the class, because this is really the core concept that I want to teach in this class, which is about causality and about not how much we should care about the environment. I assume everybody cares about protecting the environment. We all feel bad about how much we're destroying it, all that stuff. I assume you come in with that. Now the question is how, once you've got your heart in the right place, how do you use your mind to figure out what should we do? And so we'll talk about that, but I'm going to talk about it in very theoretical terms today and try to give you a model for how do you think about it. How do you think about a problem? And that's why I gave you this article on looking good in the workplace, because I think these people observe something and then they say, how do we understand it? How do we make sense of the fact that beautiful people make more money than ugly people, right? And we'll go through that for a second. I want to also talk about these issues like the Julia Butterfly Hill sitting in a tree for 2 years. Did that work? Was it a success? How would we know? How would we evaluate whether should we go sit in a tree or not? Right? Because we don't, I mean, how do we evaluate, was Julia Butterfly Hill sitting in a tree up in the North Coast redwoods for 2 years, was that a success? And we're going to go through that process of thinking through, is it a success or not? And part of this comes out of a whole bunch of questions about that, or a whole sense I have about that these answers matter. That understanding why something works, why something changes the world or fails to change the world matters, because we want to change the world. We see the world the way it is. We have some sense, as humans, we're able to think about the future and say, there's a better world out there that it could be like, and how do we get from where we are to where we want to be? And that involves being able to think clearly about that, what we do in the present to make the future a better place, whatever our definitions of better are, and we might well disagree on what those are. But I'd like to give you a theoretical, intellectual mechanism by which you can implement and kind of help bring into being your view of what the future should be. And I'm enough of a Democrat, small d Democrat, to believe that the world should be any combination, or that combination of everybody's view of what it should be, and I'd like to empower people to make that happen. So that's what we'll be talking about today. It relates to the basic paper that you'll be doing in the class. You all should have, where is it? You all should have done the readings for today. The first chapter in this book, plus the overview, the kind of review of international environmental politics that was in the reading, right? Has everybody got the books they need? Okay, I will put I've got 2 extra copies of this and this science plan, which I'll talk about in a second, that I'll put on reserve in the IPS, International Relations Lounge down the hall. Okay, so rather than put them on in the library where it's kind of more of a hassle, You can pick them out. Just, you know, be respectful of your colleagues. So I don't know, how many people will use reserve readings? Okay, a few? Great. Okay, so I'll put them there, but it doesn't seem like there's only 3 or 4 of you. So just kind of be respectful. Don't take something out for more than a day, let's say. And just, you know, it doesn't become your personal copy for the term. But you can see in Young's stuff for today, he talks mainly a lot about regimes in general and regime effectiveness in particular, which is one of the issues that we'll be focusing on. What are the effects of these regimes? That probably requires just a moment of definition. Who is not comfortable with the term regimes? Okay, everybody knows what they are? Somebody want to give me a definition? I know what they are, but I can't define them. I know them when I see them, right? It's the Supreme Court's definition of pornography. Okay, so we know what regimes are when they see them, but what's the definition? This is one of those cases actually where we have a fairly standard definition. You don't need to give me that one, but we do have one that everybody uses. But Mark, what's your definition of regime?
A set of rules or structures for sort of understanding the world in a certain way, or it's more of like a policy or program for, I don't know if I'm on the right track.
Yeah.
The policy or program for trying to structure the world in a certain way or understand the world in a certain way.
Okay. Others want to kind of complement or add to Mark's definition? Yeah.
Kind of like
Your name?
Mark.
Mark.
It's kind of like the rules of the game around which people's expectations converge.
Okay, straight out of Krasner. Around which actors' expectations converge. That's the standard definition. It's page 2 of International Regimes by Steve Krasner, 1983. And it's the right thing it should come to mind that way. I mean, it should not only come to mind because that's the standard definition that's used, but it should help give you an understanding of what it means. So what does it mean to say, why he has this complicated thing around its rules, norms, principles, and decision-making procedures around which actors' expectations converge. Around which actors' expectations converge. That's a pretty convoluted way of saying almost anything, right? So what does that mean?
It means there's certain guidelines that I guess kind of retard and guide your actions.
Okay.
So you know what to expect, what people can and can't do.
Does that mean everybody does it all the time?
No.
Okay, so is that, I think part of what he's playing with, and people who use it are playing with, is the fact that we can have, I think of it as a governance structure. Okay, a lot of what the book Global Governance and a lot of what Young talks about is governance. Notice how governance is different than government, right? We don't have an international government, but we have a system of governance. And so one way to think about it is we have some set of rules, we have norms about how people should behave. Think about not just environment, but human rights, right? We have a set of human rights treaties that have been designed in order to protect human rights. Do they protect people's human rights? Well, a lot of people's human rights are still being violated. But the question about around which actors' expectations converge, how does that link to human rights? What's the convergent expectations that's involved in human rights regimes?
Expectations about what's right and wrong and what are people's, the things that people have basic rights to for the simple fact of being human beings.
Okay, and how does expectations matter? Why doesn't it just say that people comply, the rules that people behave by?
I guess because in different countries you have different sets of expectations, and certain countries have more of an influence over other ones about what the human rights norms should be.
Okay, and your name is?
Kim.
Kim. Okay, so, and especially taking Kim's thing that different countries have different expectations and different views about human rights. But what the governance structure of the human rights regimes have done over the last 50 years is help those actors' expectations converge. So 50 years ago, 100 years ago, the view of what women's rights should be was defined by 180 countries who each had a different view of that, right? Now, the way women are treated in different countries still differs quite significantly, but there's an expectation that women should be treated equally, right? And it may well be because the West is shoving it down everybody else's throat, right? And we may or may not feel good about that, but that's certainly that power is involved here. It's not merely that we called up God, God said, here's how people should be treated, and then we wrote it down in law and everybody else will follow it. And we just, as the powerful West and the United States, happen to have a lock on the phone call to God here. That's sort of the implication, but in fact what we see is, whether it's right or wrong, there is a convergent set of expectations about this is how human rights should be defined and then how people should be treated. We see the same in environmental affairs, right? Is anybody going to comply with the Kyoto Protocol of the Framework Convention on Climate Change? Probably not. Most countries are probably going to violate it. Is there nonetheless an expectation that you should be trying to reduce your CO2 emissions and other emissions? Yes. And so what creates this regime is this sense of not merely the expectations, but it's everything around a system, all the elements that surround a system of governance, okay? So it's not merely the treaty text. That's what we're going to try focus on a lot in the class. So it's not merely the treaty text, but it's also the actors, the NGOs, the states, everybody else who helps kind of implement the treaty. It's the states not only in their efforts to implement the treaty, but also in their implements to get it implemented against other states, right? So sanctioning behavior, rewards, etc. The businesses that will be involved, in different treaties. It's that the set of norms that are out there that nobody really has, but they're out there in kind of some little ether out there, right? The set of here's how things should happen, even if nobody believes it should apply to them or whatever. All of that is this governance structure, right? And so we can think of lots of other examples of it, but those give you a few. Is everybody comfortable with that definition? Everybody feel like they're comfortable with it? Because it's going to be underlying underlying theme in the class, and I kind of hope you get that concept. And if you don't, come in and talk to me during office hours today from 3 to 6. I would welcome you coming in anytime for office hours. And if those don't work for you because of classes or something, we can arrange another time. I prefer you come then. But my office is up in East Wing of this building, but you can't get there from here. You have to go outside. East Wing 416, okay? Just a word to kind of motivate this for you. For the final paper, you're going to be evaluating a treaty, evaluating a regime, but largely by looking at the treaty text and saying, did that treaty succeed at changing behavior defined in some way? And part of that you'll see in these, which I'll put on reserve down the hall. This is the science plan, written largely by Orrin Young. But it says, what are the important questions that we need to address in international environmental politics? What are the unanswered questions that we don't know enough about yet? And you got some of that in his intro to the book. You got some of it in my review essay for the readings for today. Some sense of what are the questions that people care about? I'm going to try to keep you focused on one of those sets of questions of the implementation of regimes, of what are the effects of regimes, because I want to focus it down and get you to practice in sort of over the course of this term in one area. So I want you to practice doing causal analysis because it's very hard to do. It's exceptionally hard to do well. And I think it's worth learning how to do that, even if it constrains what you can write on for this term, because I think it'll give you a set of skills that help you to understand it better for future stuff. So let's start out with, before we get there then, is what are some questions we might ask about international environmental politics? So what are questions people are interested in? And this is open season, anything you're interested in. Give me some ideas, because I want to kind of show there's a lot of questions out there and only one type that I want, or there's one type that I'm particularly interested in giving you a set of skills that will help you answer that kind of question. So what are some questions? Eli.
How you measure effectiveness of international regimes or treaties.
Okay, so first is how we measure effectiveness, but I want to be even more specific, like what are some questions you want to know the answer to? So I'll put up one as an example. So one question I'm interested in is, does free trade harm the environment? Right? That's one question I'd like to know. Other questions like that, and you can be very specific or whatever, but not even other questions like that. Any question you're interested in. What's a question you wish you knew the answer to? Connor.
Do global treaties make a difference?
Okay. Global treaties matter. Okay, other questions? And they can be very specific too. Yeah, your name?
Diana.
Diana.
Is GATT or the WTO going to make MLAs null and void? And is it going to be a confrontation to?
Will GATT make MLAs, multilateral agreements? Okay. Multilateral agreements, what?
Null and void.
No,
basically.
okay. So essentially, will GATT eviscerate or emasculate the environmental treaties we have? And so we have all these wonderful environmental treaties, 200-odd multilateral ones and a bunch of bilateral ones, all these great treaties, and GATT comes along and says, no, wrong, no, wrong, no, wrong, no, wrong, no, right?
Or just maybe, is there going to be a restructuring of the dispute settlement body so that doesn't occur?
Okay. Okay. Great. More like, or more questions that are just, that reflect Diana's particular interest, more questions that reflect your particular interest, okay? So don't try to give me the answer you think I want, you know, of this, but what do you care about? Yeah, your name.
My name's Megan. Megan?
Megan, okay.
How do emerging markets, how are they expected to balance environmental concerns with emerging economies?
Okay. So how do emerging markets balance environment and growth, sort of, okay, right? My line on sustainable development is, yeah, sustainable development means developing well and taking care of the environment in most of the world, neither of which we do well. Why don't we try to do them both together? That makes sense. We don't do A well, we don't do B well. Let's try to do them simultaneously. That makes a whole lot of sense. Okay, so another question.
Does and or will NGOs or local indigenous people have any effect on deforestation negotiations or issues?
Okay. What effect of NGOs or indigenous groups on deforestation? Okay. Other questions? People want to know. Yeah, your name?
Sarah.
Sarah, I'm sorry, I didn't get your name.
Alex.
Alex, okay. Sarah?
In the future, will more resources be put into developing like renewable energy sources or like solar?
Okay.
On a global level or different
In
places?
future, will more money be put into renewables? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Others? Well, one or two more. Anything you're interested in, doesn't matter. I won't laugh. Okay, well, did you, yeah. Your name?
Just Emily.
Emily.
Like, how will we balance countries' like political, I don't know, political greed with environmental problems? I mean,
okay.
That's like the overall arching like problem here.
Well, we better if we don't. In other words, if we don't solve the big problems, I mean, one way to solve all the little problems is to solve the big problems, right? So, how do we balance? Let's use a poli-sci word, sovereignty and environmental protection, right? Does that more or less capture your question, Emily?
Yes.
Okay, how do we balance this thing about states? You know, and part of what we'll discuss it later on in the class is, are states the problem or the solution to our environmental woes, right? And there are different debates on that. So in some ways we could ask, what's the effect of the state, or yeah, what's the effect of the state on the environment? Does it make it better or worse? I mean, it's the same question as, does free trade harm the environment? Does the fact that the world is set up around states harm the environment or help, right? Okay. Yeah, your name?
Kate.
Kate.
I'm just curious how George W.'s presidency is going to affect the environmental movement in general. How important it is who's president.
Okay. Okay, so how will W's administration influence U.S. and perhaps global, right? Because the U.S. is a powerful state, global environmental policy, okay, and trend. Good, that's something we care about too. Yeah, Diana?
Is there anything we can learn from past treaties that will bring the North-South into agreement on environmental issues?
Okay, so let's just, what brings North and South together? Great. Okay, so we have a range of questions, and I think it's important to realize that there are a range of questions that we care about. There's a bunch of different questions in any field, and we're going to, again, I would hope that as we go through this environmental stuff, I will try to teach you something about the environment, but what I'm actually trying to teach you more about is how to think about issues. So hopefully the kinds of skills I give you are skills you can use for housing policy in Detroit, for, you know, who knows, for improving minimum wage in Brazil, for anything else like that. Those are the kinds of questions I'm interested in. How do you make policy more effective? That's the main goal. And we'll use environment as just an example of that as a way of thinking about it. It seems to me there's a bunch of different questions that we care about. And let me lay out what I would call models. And I don't know if I'll be able to fit all these in them, but there's some that are merely factual or descriptive. Okay, so for example, what you know, it's kind of trying to describe what's the state of play. So we might want to know, is the Earth warming or not? Right? That matters, because if it's not, then we can go on about our business about burning fossil fuels from now till the cows come home and not worry about it, right? Likewise, with, you know, we wanted to know, we now know it, we wanted to know whether CFCs deplete the ozone layer, right? We want to know questions about, we want to know how big the ozone hole is, right? Just a fact. There's a fact that God knows how big the ozone hole in the ozone layer is this year. We want to know it too, so that we can do something with it, but we want to know that. We want to know how many species are dying out each year. So there's a kind of factual or descriptive questions. There's another set of questions that are, or questions and statements that are normative. So we could have questions about, I mean, and notice that a lot of these include normative statements, right? So what brings the North and South together, Diana's question, and not to critique it, but to say, hey, underlying that is a notion that North and South should be brought together, right? We could also ask questions about what kinds of treaties are equitable, with an underlying assumption that equity is a good thing rather than a bad thing, rather than that we like that, you know, that we like inequity. Maybe we have, most of us have a belief that equity should be increased and inequity decreased, but we would want to know which treaties are more equitable and which ones are less equitable. Some questions are prescriptive. Okay, that is, we want to ask questions that allow us to suggest what should happen. Okay, there's a couple of questions in this group. This isn't in the lecture notes. All of you should know the lecture notes are online, right? So you can download them before class. So that it saves you having to write in class, and you can then just annotate the notes from online. predictive in the sense of what's likely to be the future. Okay? So things like how will W's administration influence U.S. global environmental policy? Will GATT make the multilateral agreements null and void? That's something about, we want to know about the future. But a lot of these roll back in, at least for me, that anything that's motivated by that, it ends up being motivated by something usually prescriptive, but then that in turn folds back to what I will call causal questions about why. Questions about why does something happen? So let me try to put most of these, fold them back until we get to a causal question. So what brings North and South together? That's a causal question. I think certain kinds of things, certain kinds of negotiations tend to get the North and South together, and other kinds of negotiations tend not to. Right? So if you frame an environmental issue in terms of how it will help industrial policy, the South ain't going to be very interested because they don't have an industry to have an industrial policy for. Okay? If you frame it, so the goal of the kind of sustainable development notion back in the late 80s was to say, how do we get the North and South together? And what we might be interested in causally is to say, did the notion of sustainable development help or hurt, right? Did it bring the people more together or farther apart? Do we just have more to argue about? That's important because then we say, why do we care about whether the notion of sustainable development helped or harmed the environmental movement, in a sense, the global environmental movement? Because we've got this other concept in our head, and we think we want to promote this concept because it'll help bring North and South together. And we better be able to tell these kinds of concepts bring North and South together, and these kinds of concepts don't. So we're going to use sustainable development as an example of a kind of concept which either succeeded or failed at bringing North and South together. So that's why we would care to look back in 1989 and see when the Brundtland Commission came out with a report on, our common future, did that help or harm the movement towards environmental protection and towards bringing the South in? I'll get to Eli's question about how we measure effectiveness. How will W's administration influence global environmental policy? That's a predictive question, right? It's about the future. Can we know the answer to that? Of course not, right? W will be different than any other person who might be president. That said, can we make some predictions? Could we, and how would we go about making those predictions? Well, one way is to say, there are kind of examples of George W.'s behavior that we can use to figure out what's likely to happen. One is to take what was his behavior in Texas, right? And use that as a predictor about his future behavior. That is, people don't change that much, right? You know that the way I'm going to teach on Thursday is pretty similar to how I'm going to teach today. So you can predict, if you're shopping for this class, you predict that I will tend to teach the same way over the course of the term, and that's different than somebody else. So you say, Ron Mitchell's personality and his pedagogy, his way of teaching isn't going to change over time that much, so we can predict how he's going to teach, and we can say we like that or we don't like that. Similarly here, we can look at W's behavior in Texas and say that gives us some way to predict the future of how he'll run the administration in the White House. But we also probably care about that because making a prediction out about he's going to behave and what's that likely to do for the environment can then be important to us as if we're activists who are pushing the environment and think Gail Norton is going to harm the environment rather than help it. It gives us a sense of what we should do. That's important, in terms of trying to predict what's going to happen. And I had an idea on that, but it just vanished. Okay. Will GATT make the multilateral agreements null and void? Going back to W's administration. One of the things I've been talking with friends, who want to know, well, what do I think about kind of this question? One of the things is to say, well, one of the interesting but counterintuitive things, one of the things you wouldn't predict at first, but we can predict it now based on past experience, is to say, actually, W may be a pretty good environmental president. Why? Because Sarah? Yeah, Sarah.
I was just gonna say, because maybe it'll really inspire like or environmental programs to be like, oh, we have to be on guard, we have to push things through, we have to be really effective.
Okay, so one is that it mobilizes the NGO community and like that, right? So one is that. The other is, look at who created the National Environmental Protection Act and the EPA. Richard Nixon. Why? Because he was a very right-wing president who, to get reelected, had to appeal to left-wing voters, right? And so in a counterintuitive way, Bush, he already has the right wing in his pocket. The votes he needs come re-election time in 4 years will be the left-wing votes, the kind of environmental votes, and so he will do things to get them on board. And so that, although it may be scary in prospect, maybe we don't need to worry too much about it. Or maybe it's because of what Sarah's saying, that Nixon was pushed by NGOs at the time. We would want to know that. We would want to try to sort that kind of question out. To know, is it necessary for NGOs to really be active, or will Bush, on his own, with no pressure, realize what the politics are and try to get votes from the liberal left, right? The kind of the Sierra Club or not. It'd be good to know, because if you're in an NGO, you need to know where to spend your very limited resources. You have only $10 million this year to spend. Should you spend it on lobbying on the Hill? Should you spend it on writing letters to Congress? I mean, to George W. Or will all that take care of itself and you can worry about other things, right? Worry about growing, take your $10 million and actually go save a wetland somewhere or something like that. And that matters. It matters a lot, because you only got $10 million and you can either throw it away down a rat hole that will take care of itself anyway, or you can go fix something. And you got to know which to do. And it goes to these questions too. Will the GATT make multilateral agreements null and void? We need to make some predictions about what's the GATT's effect likely to be, because we got to know whether to waste time working against it or not. Will it take care of itself or not? We don't know that, and it matters enough because we have resources we're going to expend. All of the how do emerging markets balance environment and growth? This is sort of framed as a descriptive question, right? It's just, we're just trying to describe it. But really what we want to know is, at least to me, the thing I care about is, how do we help emerging markets do it? That means we have to look at a bunch of emerging markets and say, this one's doing it well, this one's doing it poorly. What's the difference, right? So that's the kinds of questions I want to keep pushing you back for. This may be how you phrase it initially, but I want you to reframe it to say, okay, which emerging markets, what is it about some emerging markets that allows them to balance these two things and other ones to not do it so well? That's, I think, what I really want to push you to keep framing it back as that kind of question of a cause, right? Something about some kinds of emerging markets, ones that have C as their first letter, right? And how they address this balance between environment and growth, right? And obviously it's not C as the first letter, but something else that we think matters, right? And we got to sort that out. Why? Because then we can proceed to make that true for all of the emerging markets so that they can do it, right? I mean, one of the ways to think about this, too, because we're in a policy class where policy is important, is to think about questions where we do have this attempt at causal analysis, what causes something to happen, but we can sometimes find things that cause something to happen that we can't manipulate. Okay? And the classic example, for those of you who've taken basic IR, is the democratic peace theory, right? We have this theory about, do democracies fight wars more or less often with non-democracies? And it's as close to a law as we have in political science that democracies tend not to fight other democracies, but tend to be very war-prone towards non-democracies. But it's like, if we found out that democracies were more prone, we all become authoritarian states? No, we're not willing to manipulate that lever to say, okay, it's worth it, but at least we would know the trade-off, right? We would know you get democracy, but you get war with it, right? And those are the two things that go together. It's nice in this case that the two things that two good things go together, democracy, or what we consider here in America as good things, and not everybody would agree with us, but that democracy and peace go together. But notice that it's not a policy manipulable variable, right? Democracy or not. We're not going to change to a non-democracy because it creates war. But it does maybe tell us that, okay, if you're going to be a democracy, you've got to work like hell to prevent war, if we knew that was the outcome, right? War will not take care of itself if you're a democracy. Those are the kinds of questions. why do these kinds of these causal questions matter? For me, they matter because we get it wrong all the time. Because the Sudan case, right, went in to prevent war in Sudan, went in to help people. We ended up, the CARE people ended up giving a lot of money to bring in food aid, which ended up killing a lot of people, okay? Their assessment, don't ask, don't tell policy in the American military to prevent gay battering, increase gay battering according to all analyses, right? Did something for a good reason, bad effect. Economic proposal, going back to the emerging markets, economic proposals to aid economic development in Eastern Europe. Caused a lot of economic harm. The Jeff Sachs of the world from Harvard going in and saying, here, shock therapy for your economy, here's how we fix your economy. Made it worse in most countries except Poland and Slovenia, as far as most analyses go, right? Made things actually worse. Made their economies worse off than would have happened if we just left it alone. Another one was actually in the paper today, Jane Brody's article in the Science Times today, talking about all this wonderful stuff we've been doing to make our houses more efficient. What's at least one of the effects of that? Increasing cancer. Right? Because if you've got a nice breezy house where the wind's going through it all the time, none of the pollutants in the house build up. That you have air processing through. But if you have a really airtight house, all the carcinogens, all the radon, all the urea from your building materials, all the little chemicals that make up our sheetrock and wood and everything else that's in your house, they just nice and accumulate in your house, and you breathe them in and out, in and out, in and out. So hopefully, with luck, we'll kill off all the enviros who have, weatherproof their houses, and the world will be taken over by the non-enviros who have these houses where they just turn up the heat to 75 and leave the windows open, right? But I mean, I think it's sort of at least realizing that there's this weird, we live in a complex world where we don't have the effects we expect to have, right? That things turn out different than we hope. Let's then talk for a second about these questions with the Julia Butterfly Hill case, and then I've got just another case to sort of start discussion about, and it goes to these, how do we measure effectiveness? Do you have a mask on that? Okay, so here's another one. You can't read this. I can't even read it, and I'm up at the front. But this is the group Earth Liberation Front claims responsibility for fires in a Long Island subdivision late last month and for fires causing $12 million in damage at a ski resort in Vail. Okay, kind of another environmentalist kind of thing. This is the Earth Liberation Front. Trying to do things. What's their goal? I mean, what do you imagine? We don't need to know what ELF really is for, but let's make some rash assumptions about what their goal is. Anybody?
Disrupt our society so that, I don't know, maybe they get enough publicity that they'll try and change some of the ways that capitalists do things in our society that destroy the environment.
Okay, so I mean, in the end, to protect the environment through some process by disrupting normal business and saying, hey, hello, your attention please, we're screwing the environment. Now what do you think, okay, so do people, so we now know what their goal is. I remember reading about this about a year and a half. They went in and blew up this ski resort, or basically did it's monkey wrenching, right? It's Edward Abbey's monkey wrenching going, the best way to deal with the dam is to go blow it up, right? I love his line, which is he was supposedly being interviewed by Jan Wenner of Rolling Stone, and they're driving down the road in Arizona somewhere. He's drinking a beer, he throws it out the window. And Wenner says, my God, you're an environmentalist, and you're littering, you're throwing a beer can out the window. And Edward Abbey supposedly responds, I'm a hell of a lot more concerned about the road beside the beer can than I am about the beer can beside the road. And I mean, an important sense of priorities, right, about why are we worried about the beer can beside the road when it's really the road that's the problem here. But, I mean, the question is, so we know what they're trying to do. The question is it successful? Is the environment, and how do you even think about that? How do you begin to think about, is it successful? And I think we can also look at the Julia Butterfly Hill case. She sat in a tree for 2 years. She came down, They protected the little area around the redwood. Does anybody know the end of that story? Sarah?
They got slashed and basically gonna die.
Some lumberjacks, right, went in and, or somebody with a chainsaw. If that defines you as a lumberjack is another question. But somebody with a chainsaw went in and cut halfway through the tree, right, through Luna. And they've now got these weird little brackets that kind of hopefully will prevent it from falling over, right? Until they come in from the other side and cut the other half of the tree. But, okay, so the question is, in both these cases, has it been a success?
Depends on your definition.
Very good. Depends on your definition. So if we're going to do any paper in this class, and we're going to define whether a treaty had an effect or was successful, we better start by defining what do we mean. For the purposes of this study, we're going to define the success of this treaty as X. Yes, so key point. Depends what your definition is. We can only define whether something is effective or successful, and we're going to use those terms interchangeably. Did it work? If we know what we mean by work. Because things tend to have a lot of effects, right? I mean, think about your education here at Stanford. Was it a success? Well, for you, you learned a lot, and you can now have really fun intellectual conversations at night in your dorms with your colleagues, and your parents are saying, show me the money, you know? I mean, how are you going to take care of me in my old age? Two different definitions of success. From your point of view, great success because you feel good, you enjoy the conversation, all that stuff. Your parents are saying, complete failure. She's going to go out and make 20 grand a year. What am I going to do in my old age? My stocks are in the tank. You know, where's my future, right? Two different definitions of success of the same thing. Not because they wouldn't, even your parents would say, oh, it's wonderful that she's having all those conversations at night in her dorm, but I'm worried about the money. Or vice versa, right? I mean, these day and age, it's you guys who are worried about the money, and your parents are worried, yeah, but where's some intellectual stimulation going on in my kid? You know, so two definitions of success, right? So I think one is, what do we define as success? Okay? And importantly, one way to think about it is, what are the effects of something? Don't call it success or failure, effective or not effective. What are the effects? The effect of your college education is to lower your income stream and increase your ability to have an interesting conversation, right? Those are two effects. We don't have to get into whether it's a success or a failure. Just saying those are the effects of doing that, of having gone to Stanford, these are the effects. Okay? So one is we would need to know what is our definition of success. Okay, so what are some definitions? One is to take the definition as a good place to start is, what did they try to do? Right? If we are going to go into success, well, what were you trying to do and did you do it? That's a reasonable definition of success, right? If only because if you try to do something, if you don't try to do something, you're unlikely to achieve it, right? If you try to do it, you may or may not. But it's unusual that we achieve something good without having tried, right? So the first is to say, well, what were you trying to do? And for treaties, you want to say, well, what were the treaty people trying to do? What were the people the countries who signed the treaty? What was their effort? What was their goal? And then to walk back from that and say, okay, did they achieve it or not? Okay. So in these cases, I mean, what would people's judgment? Sarah, you know the story of Luna and Julia Butterfly Hill, or seem to. Think it was a success? Was she a success? Would you now say to Julia Butterfly Hill, yeah, it's now back in 1997 when she started tree sitting or whatever, right? Here, I got an idea for you. Why don't you go sit in a tree? Or more importantly, why don't you go, I mean, do you, even if it's not you, would you recommend to somebody, you know, to your, another friend of yours to go up to Oregon to another place where they're about to do a clear cut? Would you recommend this as a strategy or not?
Well, I think that she, like, first of all, if you say, okay, her goal was to protect this tree, then and the tree is going to die, probably, or is very hurt, may die.
From the cut, you mean?
From the cut, yeah. And so then you could say she failed, she didn't succeed, people shouldn't sit in trees. Because, and you know, you could say because, you could also go on to say like, well, it's because she brought so much attention to it and that was a bad thing. But you can also
important
say
point
she
there.
Protected she protected more than just that tree. It was a statement she protected a lot more of the old growth redwoods. And you could say the attention brought to that situation was good. A lot more people know about the benefits of protecting old growth redwoods, and that it's a good thing because of the efforts that she made.
Okay. So actually, Sarah just went to this to Diana's question of, well, how do you define success? And she just defined it in 3 or 4 different ways, right? To say, and notice that if there's something we like, right, we will redefine success until we find some way in which we can define it as successful, right, rather than admit it's a total and complete failure, right? And if it's something a policy we don't like, we'll find all the ways. We'll focus on all the ways it's a failure, right? If we want to go down, if we want to beat up on NAFTA, we can find all the ways it's harmed the environment. But the important point that Sarah explicitly raised is that we need to know whether the tree was cut because of her sitting, right? And that involves saying what? What's the best way to get at that question? Did her sitting cause it, Connor?
A counterfactual.
Very good. What's a counterfactual, Connor?
To say, hypothetically, had she not been sitting in the tree, would the tree still have been cut?
Great. What's the difference between a counterfactual and saying that before she sat in the tree, the tree hadn't been cut, and after she sat in the tree, it did, which is partly our argument, right? Before it wasn't cut, she sat in the tree, afterwards it was cut. Looks like she caused it to be cut, right? So what's the difference between what you described, a counterfactual, and that claim I just made, which is tree, Julia Butterfly Hill, tree whole, Julia Butterfly Hill sitting for 2 years, tree cut. That looks like a causal story that we often tell, right? So what's the difference between that and a counterfactual?
Well, in the first case, we're directly inferring causality and say it wasn't just in sequence. What you're saying is it was just in sequence. She sat there and then afterwards was cut, but we're not. If we're saying it was cut because she sat there, we have to sort of say a bit more.
Okay, but I want to push a little bit about what we're using. In both cases, I mean, that is what I said, but let me clarify. One way to make an argument that her sitting caused the tree to be cut is to say, look, here's my evidence. Tree before she sits in it, she sits in it, tree's cut. Therefore, it must be true that her sitting caused the cut. What's the difference between that and a counterfactual kind of argument? Eli?
Well, counterfactual, you'd say, like, tree hasn't been cut, she doesn't sit in it, and then see what you think would happen to the tree. And if it was still going to be cut, then you can't really infer causality there.
So it's a slight difference, but the key is that the way I describe the evidence was to compare what did happen to some previous state of affairs, right? And the counterfactual compares it to a state of affairs that never did happen, that never existed, right? And Connor was getting at it, but it's the sense that what would the tree look like had she not sat in it, everything else being the same, right? All the other things in the world moving forward, the desire for lumber markets and everything else that would affect a tree being cut, right? So that's how we get at causality, right? Is always you're saying, let's change only one thing, her not sitting in the tree. And in fact, given what she was sitting in the tree for, what was the likelihood what's the real, so how does that make the world different? How does it make the argument different? What was the big success of Julia Butterfly Hill? That the tree was only cut halfway. Right? Because if she hadn't sat in it, they were going to clear cut that area. So Luna was half protected by her. Rather than seeing it as a failure, right, by thinking about the counterfactual, it turns it on its head in a very interesting way to say the success is measured precisely by the fact that the cut only went through halfway. Right? And see how that's a very different model. Right? And we have to do a much more complex reading of this to make sure that was right. But at that simple level, do you see the difference between what a counterfactual allows you to say? Right? The other one says, well, look, she kind of failed or she didn't succeed wholly. But the other is to say, no, it's a huge success because the tree would have been cut down and in the sawmill 2 years later. And instead, it's still standing, it might survive, and it's only halfway cut down. And that, I think, is this core of the counterfactual. And it's nice that Connor raised it, because I think counterfactual is a hugely powerful analytic tool. And it's really important to kind of get that sense of that we determine causality by use of counterfactuals. And we do it all the time. And you all do it all the time. And what I want to do is get you doing it explicitly, not implicitly. Not just guessing around about it, but actually thinking it through rigorously and saying, what would the world have been like without this thing that I'm going to call the cause? And again, I on flights over the holidays saw It's a Wonderful Life. If you've lived in America for more than a year, you have had to have seen it at least 10 times. But for those of you who haven't, did I talk about this last class a little bit? Okay. It's the best example of a counterfactual ever. And it's what we all strive for and will never achieve in social science. But in It's a Wonderful Life, for those who, how many have seen it? Okay, most of you have. But essentially, the first half, 2/3 of the movie, is you see Jimmy Stewart living this life, taking care of this bank in this poor town, where the poor people are getting screwed by the greedy businessman. Okay? And then he sees kind of the little town going to hell in a handbasket. And what does he decide to do? Somebody who's seen it.
Jump off a bridge.
Jump off a bridge. Commit suicide. Because he thinks, you know, because he thinks what?
That his life hasn't made a difference.
That his life hasn't made a difference. And then what happens, Kim? Where's the counterfactual?
His friend Clarence the Angel takes him out of existence and goes back and shows him how everybody's life would have been different if he had never been born, and then he can see the impact that he made.
Exactly right. So he says, take the same world and change one thing. And what's that one thing, Kim?
The birth of Jimmy Stewart.
The birth of the Jimmy Stewart character. Yeah. I forget what his name is, but George Bailey. Right? It's just change one thing and one thing only, and let the world move forward without that one thing. And that's the counterfactual. And so what we try to do in good social science is be like Clarence the Angel and say, and run the world through a video the same way with only one thing changed. Why do you only change one thing? Because you want to know that that was the cause, right? You don't get rid of George Bailey and 3 other people, because then the difference in the world, you can't determine which of the 4 things mattered, right? Which of the 4 people made the difference. You don't know whether it was his or his wife or the greedy character or whatever, right? So what's important is to try to hold everything else constant and change one thing. Now, this kind of leads into this Do Looks Matter article, because that's what they're trying to do, okay? You think, how is he relating all this stuff? I have no idea. But in the Do Looks Matter, I mean, you had a chance to read this. I want to talk about it for a second. One is, I must be really ugly, because if you look at my paycheck at the end of every month, I'm like really ugly. But the argument here is that, or what are the parts of the argument that are being made here? Okay, so where does it start? It starts with an observation. What's the observation?
There are differences in the amount of pay some people receive in their success.
Okay. So the first is we have differences in amount of pay. Okay? So we have something we observe. We're going to call that, I don't know, we have something we observe, which we're going to call our dependent variable. And we observe that, and we observe differentials in pay, right? High pay and low pay, for lack of better terms. And we observe out here some independent variable, and what is it, Diana? What's the first observation? That what goes with high pay and what goes with?
Difference in looks.
Okay.
Good looks, bad looks.
Okay, so good looks and bad looks. Okay, ugly people and beautiful people, right? And ugly people make low pay and beautiful people make high pay. Consistent differential. One is, what's one interesting thing about, just with this part of it, what's one of the interesting parts they have to do research they want to figure out why. Not only why, but how this happens, right? Why do they care about how this happens?
They want to make a more equitable playing field for everyone.
Right. Okay. They want to make it a more equitable playing field, and they got to know where to intervene in the process, right? Okay. So, but what's the first part? How do they deal with it? How do they measure this part? What? Yeah. What's the amount of money that people make? Your name again? Sorry. Negative. So this is easy, right? Look at pay stubs, right? Or look at tax returns or whatever. What about this part? Easy to observe?
Very subjective.
Very subjective. Does it not matter because it's subjective? No, in fact, the subjectivity is precisely what we think is driving this, right? The fact that people kind of have, however subjective it is, people have, on average, believe certain people are more beautiful than other people, right? That we've, for whatever reasons, either evolutionary reasons or because we're all susceptible to so much advertising that we all agree that, that whoever the supermodels are look beautiful, and ditto for men, right? So how do they then go about, so the first thing they have to do is go out about and measure what is good looking and what's ugly, right? So how do they do that, Kim?
They kind of have to take an average of the votes. They have like a panel of 4 people who decide whether or not these photos are pictures of good-looking people or bad-looking people, and they have to take an average of what each of those 4 people say.
Okay. So the first thing they have to do, though, is at least measure their independent variable, right? Observe it somehow. Get a feel for what's good-looking and what's ugly, right? Okay. I want to make sure everybody understand what a variable is and what's a value. What are the variables here? Somebody give me the names of the variables on these two. Eli.
Looks and pay.
Looks and pay. What are these things, Eli?
Those are the values.
These are the values. Okay? People understand the difference between values and variables. Variable is color. Values are Roy G. Biv, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, right? So here is looks, are they good or bad? And the pay is it high or low? Okay? And what's the dependent what is dependent variable? Somebody else, somebody who hasn't talked yet. Why is this the dependent variable? Pay. Yeah, your name?
Risa.
Risa? Okay, Risa.
Because it depends on the independent variable.
Most excellent. Very good. That's how you know, because it depends on something. That's why they call it the dependent variable, because it is dependent on, what is it really dependent on? I mean, can you give a full statement of, this is dependent on that?
The amount of pay is dependent on whether a person is good looking or bad looking.
Right. And in the language of social science, it's the value of the dependent variable pay is dependent on the value of the independent variable looks. Okay? So that, just to make sure we're all talking the same terminology, because I'll throw these around pretty quick. Is pay always a dependent variable, Risa?
Is pay always?
Yeah. I mean, pay is a dependent variable. Could I make it an independent variable?
You could. And
How?
You could say that no, because according to the experiment, the dependent.
Oh, forget their experiment. Tell me how you make it a independent variable. I want pay to be an independent variable. Can I do that?
Yeah.
Okay, how?
You could say people with high pay, and then set a dependent variable that's dependent on.
Okay.
Like, for example, the number of kids or something.
Yeah, okay, right. That do people who make a lot of money have more kids? Yeah. Your name in the back.
Oh, Martha?
Martha.
I was just going to say that you could actually invert the two and say, does good looks depend on how much money you have? You could get plastic surgery.
Yeah.
More money on those may have, like,
might go the other way.
Right, so the actual causality here of what causes what, it could be the problem with the argument in this article.
Right. Okay. So one of the things that you want to often watch for is the causality the other direction, right? Did the pay cause, I mean, if I made more money, I could be better looking, right? Have a nice little toupee going on, like that. But I can't afford one. So So I think, I mean, there's two ways you can make it the independent variable. One is, as Risa said, to say, well, something, obviously, there's lots of things that depend on how much money you make, like how many kids you have, what school your kids go to, a variety of other things, what kind of car you drive are dependent variables, to which pay is probably an independent variable. Now then, just I want to get back to environment. You, as probably most of you do, even more so than I. What did they do to kind of try to sort things out here? They have kind of two competing theories here, right? What are the competing theories? Competing theories are that, hey, you got a bunch of prejudiced or lookist employers, and the others, no, the employers are responding to economic forces, and there's a bunch of lookist consumers, to which, hey, corporations are remunerating people for how much they bring in for the firm. Okay, so Emily, how do they try to, okay, so now I got two competing theories, and you got to know, should we beat up, if you're a policy wonk, right, you say, should we beat up on consumers, or should we beat up on employers, right?
Well, they looked at self-employed lawyers.
Okay.
And the amount of clients they got, and they saw that good-looking lawyers got more clients, so the idea comes down to the consumers are the people that are picky and want good-looking people working for them.
Right. Okay. So so notice how their competing theories led them to a certain kind of thing. Why do they only pick lawyers? Why don't they just get a whole batch of people from all kinds of walks of life and da-da-da-da-da? What did they actually do to try to move towards Clarence's little social science experiment with George Bailey? Right? In the Clarence experiment, he holds everything constant except one thing. We know we don't have Clarence working for us, but what do these social scientists, economists, do to try to move towards that end of the spectrum where everything else is called constant? What do?
They create a test case.
Okay, Kari, what's the test case?
So the test case, they narrow it as much as possible and have a group of lawyers. And then so it'd add too many variables if they had lawyers and doctors and everything, just like you're saying, if there are 4 people versus 1 person.
Okay, so they select only lawyers. What else do they do? I mean, even more than that, are they even more refined? I can't. Same school, right? I mean, you don't want to compare people from Harvard to people from University of Oregon to people from, that law school on the back of the matchbooks, right? The sort of mail in for your degree sort of thing. We don't because why those things? Why are you controlling why did they not control for hair color? Oh, actually, this is actually a weird case where they probably would have. Why did they not control for, it's hard to think of things that don't somehow relate to looks. But why did they not control for how many letters were in their last name? Okay, it doesn't really matter, you're right, but what do we mean by it doesn't really matter?
It wouldn't affect the test case at all. Or
what do you mean? It wouldn't affect, what do you mean by the test case? You understand, but just put it more, it wouldn't affect this, right?
No, and it wouldn't affect the independent variable as well.
It probably is unrelated to this, but it also wouldn't affect this. We don't have any reason to believe that how many letters are in your last name affect your pay scale, right? Actually, in some ways, if it's auto mechanics, we actually might worry about this because it would matter what's the first letter of your name, right? Because people get their auto mechanics from the yellow pages where they're listed alphabetically, and people whose names start with A, B, or C are probably used more than people who are W, X, Y, Z, right? So we actually might need to control for that. But we need to have a logic for the things we control for, only the things that other theorists have said matter for the value of our dependent variable. We don't have to include everything in the kitchen sink. We need to go and say, what do people think matters for pay? Things that matter are what profession you are, so we control for lawyering. What school you came from, so we control for only graduates from a certain school, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So that's what they're trying to do there. Okay, so let's now back up a second because I want to get through this. But all these theories that we have about some dependent variable are theories about causal relationships. They're about A causing B, and by definition, if A causes B, what is not A? Or if A goes with B, to say that A causes B, and we observe that A goes together with B, what does that imply about not A? Mark?
Produce not B.
What?
It'll produce not B.
It'll go together with not B, right? That's at least an initial requirement. If we see that good-looking people get high pay and bad-looking people get high pay as well, right? The average pay for both groups is the same. What happens to our theory about looks mattering? Boom, blows up, right? No evidence to support our initial theory, especially if we've done a good enough study to control for everything else, right? It could turn out that for some reason, right, if we had some other independent variable in here, like what school you go to, right, where you get your law degree, and we find out, and you know, there's some evidence to this, right, that the people who get into Harvard are on average uglier, right, and the people who get into some podunk university, right, are on average better looking, right? Then could this be true, and that what would then be our story? It's that good-looking people get paid higher, but it's balanced out by the fact that they went to a bad school, right? And vice versa, that the ugly people who went to Harvard, they got one thing working for them, they went to Harvard, but they're ugly, so their pay balanced out as high, right? So that's why you need to control for, you don't want this kind of thing to go on, right? So that's why you put Harvard. You make sure everybody went to Harvard or Stanford, or what would the alternative be? All podunk.
They did find that in the study, though, that you could counteract the good-looking looks, you know, by a year and a half more of study.
Right, so. But then, okay, so how did they do that? So they said, here's the deal. Let's see, if you're good-looking and you... No, that they said, okay, so I don't know which is a better school, but right, if you went to Stanford, right, and you're good looking, you can make up for being ugly by going to Harvard, right, because this adds a little bit more to your total salary, right? And so that you can make as much as the Stanford person did by going to Harvard if you're not so good looking to start with, right? So let's get off this example, but I think, because I want to move back to an environmental example, but I think I want you to, you will see these kinds of, I want you to start thinking this way about a lot of the world, about how would you know these things. Okay, so let's go to a more, so we have competing theories and we want to evaluate them. Let's do just free trade in the environment, okay? It's something that we think about a lot, okay? Or you read about a lot, I don't know if you think about it a lot or not, but, I'll work this example through. You have something that you care about, or what we have is a theory. And what we're going to try to do is figure out how would we do research on this theory. We have a theory that we have this variable called the state of trade, free trade, or an open economy in economic terms, right? And protectionist and a closed economy, right? And what's the dependent variable that a lot of environmentalists care about? Is the state of the environment. You can usually just talk about a variable as a state of something, okay? And what do the enviros think happens here? What's their theory? Anybody? Some new voices here. Anybody? What's the environmental argument?
Bad free trade.
What?
Bad free trade, good protection.
Yeah, right.
But doesn't it sort of depend? Like, wasn't that sort of, there were a bunch of environment, like for
Oh, we don't care about the facts yet.
Oh, okay.
We just care about, we got to get the theory right first, and then we can say all these facts get in the way of that theory. But let's get the theory. What the theory is that free trade or an open economy leads to a bad environment, and this leads to a good environment. Okay, the first thing we should say is no, right? Because we want to get it into some kind of counterfactual form that we could make use of. And so we want to put these in relative terms as worse and better, because the real theory is that if you have free trade, the environment will be worse than it would have been otherwise, right? Okay? So now the question is, so we have that theory out there. We have a competing theory which is the opposite, right? Is this a whole theory here? Like, if this is true, does this have to be true? No. What? No. We could add that if we want to claim that free trade harms the environment, do both these statements have to be true?
Oh, yeah.
Right? These are just the statement and its counterfactual, and they're all part of the same theory, right? So if we can just show either of these don't hold true, then we can probably disprove this theory, right? So that's our theory. Now, how do you then, what are some observable empirical implications of this? What are some cases that we could say, if this theory were true, then we should expect to observe what?
Tuna case. I mean that's a.
Okay. What about tuna and dolphin?
Well, you know, the WTO, the dispute settlement body overturned. It said you can't have protectionist, you know, tendencies in your trade, and so they made them stop using the turtle exclusion devices.
Okay.
Which harmed the environment.
Okay. Okay, fair enough. Let me hold on that because I want to focus on, we're just going to talk about economies, about countries first, and we're not going to get into how things end up being free trade or not. It was what you kind of laid out as why things can or cannot be free trade.
But that caused countries to not be able to make, you know,
certain rules, right. Okay, fair enough. But then I want to say, let's assume by whatever set of mechanisms we get to more free trade or more protectionist, right? In some ways, what yours is another independent variable back here, one layer, that says, how do we get to more free trade or more protection? And you're saying the GATT has led to more free trade. Now the question is, with the, and we're going to assume away the facts for a second, because I still want to, we're going to make predictions about facts, which we may already know. We may already know what the facts are, but we want to make predictions about those facts so we can observe, do the facts conform to our theory or not, to the predictions of our theory. So what are some observable implications here? Kari.
So if you, well, I mean, maybe I'm looking at an example again too. So if you looked at Mexico or something, it said because of free trade, companies started using the cheaper, like production in Mexico, and then it created, but they had much lower environmental standards, so then it was created environmental problem.
Okay, so what's nice is Kari's already going on to the theory about how it happens, right? The pathway. That what Orr and Young talks about is it's not merely do things correlate, but can we see the causal connection between them? And so one is so this is our theory, and now let's get some observable implications, which we'll get by saying, well, here are some cases, and one is Mexico pre-NAFTA, right? And we think of this as what, Kari? What's the value for this case? Mexico pre-NAFTA, what's its state of trade?
Pre-NAFTA, it was protectionist.
It's sort of protectionist, right? I mean, certainly, so we think of it as more protectionist is we're going to compare Mexico post-NAFTA. It's more free trade, right? And even if we don't know what's a protectionist society or what's a free trade society, we don't know how to define that, right, in some absolute sense, but we can say it was more free trade here than it was there. That's the big value here. Big value added by just saying, I don't know whether Eli's tall, but I can tell whether he's taller than Mark, right? And then it becomes unimportant to me. You know, go back to the looks example. It doesn't matter to me whether Eli's good looking or Mark's good looking. It matters whether Eli's more good looking than Mark in order to make a prediction about what their salaries are, right? I don't have to do it in some absolute sense, right? So we have protections from free trade, and then we have known nothing about the environment. We want to make a prediction about it so we can observe whether that correlates with our observed. What do we predict about the environment then? Kari?
That the environment was worse, was better off before the protection.
Okay, so right, better and worse.
A specific example, like say there was less water pollution or something like that.
So one is we have to make it into something that we can really measure, you know, not just kind of what's the average quality of the Mexican environment. Who knows? How do you measure that? We don't. It's like beauty, right? It's a pretty subjective thing. But we could look not only for water and then look at where are the specific implications likely to play out, right? Well, you know, so we might say, well, really what happened here, one of the big effects was to remove barriers to fertilizers moving across borders, and so go look at what's happening out in the field, in agricultural fields, right? So that's one thing to think about. But now let's think, okay, so, and that's what you think about. But what's really cool in this case is there is a ton of great social science research that has never been done because people didn't think about what other cases are there out here. Think about where would you find a good case of free trade changing to protectionism or the other way around? Over the last 30 years, where's, Connor, you should know about one, where have been a major change in the amount of free trade or protectionism among countries?
In Europe.
It's called the EU, right? Okay, so for any country, we have now at least 15, well, close to 15 cases, right, of any country pre-EU, right, and any country post-EU. And we can say that pre-EU they were more protectionist. And actually in some sense, although we can't say absolute sense, but hey, what's happening in Europe is considered the maximum in free trade, right? Get rid of all borders. So this should be the premier case of big change in how much protectionism be. And we can think about states, let's imagine the 6 states that formed the core of the EU at the beginning. When new states joined, what happened to their environment? When Greece or Spain joined, did their environment go to hell in a handbasket? That's our prediction, right? So it should have been pretty, well, it should have been, I mean, one way to think of this, that remember, before Greece joined the EU, their environment was bad. But afterwards, it's way bad, right? Extremely bad, whatever. Right? That's got to be the prediction, right? If this theory is correct, right? That every time a country joins the EU, their environment should start going to, getting worse at a faster rate than it used to. Isn't that the implication here? Is there an alternative? So we have that as a great set of cases that nobody's ever looked at, that I know of, to say, does free trade harm the environment? It would be worth doing. Now, what about the other direction? Do we have a case for the other direction?
Isolated all the other factors.
Very good. Okay, so all you're saying is we better do a really good study here. We, of course, haven't isolated all the other factors. But so we would select whether do we use Greece or Spain or Portugal or these other countries based on which one allows us to control as many other factors. Yes, exactly right. Megan.
Well, I think the difference is also that the EU is not just a free trade agreement. There's a whole lot of other stuff.
Okay, so you want to try to control for that. Good.
They won't let certain countries in unless they agree to do certain things about their environment. So it's not necessarily the free trade which is affecting their environment. It's all those agreements that they have to sign in order to get in. Okay. So yes, the world is complicated. And yes, if free trade harms the environment, we should see it here. Or we should see countervailing factors that are, but on the other hand, they had all these nice agreements that prevented them from harming the environment. But we should be able to see some of that playing out, right? Okay?
And you've got a counter theory, which is that free trade equalizes what would
standards.
Be, yeah.
Okay.
Which, bringing everyone into.
Okay. So those are all complicating factors that we have to deal with, but we want to get the first part right, which is that there's a theory out here which, if it's true, we should see something working here, right? And then what's the counterexample? Is there another one that goes in the other way? Cuba. Very good. Cuba, premier example of a country that Cuba pre-89, right, Kim? Right. Pre-89 was before when there was still a Soviet Union to help funnel them trade stuff. And post this, they were protectionist before, right? Protectionist because of an embargo, right? That is, they didn't have much free trade because the US was shutting them down. And then Cuba post-89, there's still the embargo through the whole period. But it's an increased level of protectionism, not because they're protectionist, but because they have no trade. They used to have trade with nobody except the Soviet Union. Now they have no trade with nobody at all. And what should we see as the implication is a good environment, right? Should have been pretty good before because they weren't trading with too many people. And it should have been a great environment after, right? Now, again, this is all simplified, and there's a lot of other stuff going on, right? And the question is then this also challenges us to say, what about poverty? We know poverty probably influences all this stuff and level of development. So we better get control for that. One of the nice things is, though, if we see this change, right? Probably not due to poverty, because Cuba's not, there wasn't a dramatic change in how poor Cuba was between these two periods. We can say we held that kind of constant. Level of development didn't change much, right? And it certainly didn't change as dramatically as their level of trade did, right? So if we see a dramatic change in how the environment's being protected, or how the environment is being affected at this change, right? Then we know it's not level of development, because level of development doesn't change that rapidly. Level of development takes a while to change. So that's how you can say, yes, there's other things we need to control for, but we control for them by saying, did they change dramatically at the same point in time? No. Or they did. And then if they did, then we got to say, something else we better investigate. Was that the cause of the change in the environment? Or was it something else altogether? Okay, so it's trying to get you thinking in this frame. We've run out of time, but I looked through the notes for the class, and also you have the article that myself and Bernauer wrote that you read for today as well, which kind of walks you through the steps. That's a lot of what we're going to be working on in the class.